Close your eyes.
Yo guys, welcome to my build guide for Ultimate Valby. This is going to be my take on her. She's honestly one of my favorite Descendants just because of how versatile she is. You can use her in solo bossing. She's great in the void intercepts. She's really good in the infiltrations. And she's one of the best farmers that in the game currently. So if there's a Descendant that you want to invest into, I'd highly recommend her just because of the amount of content you can complete with just her alone. So let's go ahead and get into the build guide. So the first thing I want to cover for Valby is going to be her Reactor. The best one, in my opinion, is going to be a non-attribute dimension reactor with the substats of non-attribute and skill duration up. Now, you could change this a little bit based on whatever content you happen to be doing. You could use skill cooldown in place of skill duration up, and then in place of non-attribute, you could technically get damage to Colossus. It really just depends on what type of content you're doing, but this is my preferred reactor. As for the mounting, it really depends on what type of gun you're using. Most of the time, I find myself either using Greg's Reversed Fate or Enduring Legacy for void intercept battles. When it comes to mobbing style stuff, I typically switch to Thunder Cage. When I'm doing mobbing style things, I also typically run a purple reactor as opposed to one of the ultimate reactors. The reason being is because it allows me flexibility on what gun I have out, and since I'm typically leveling different guns, this just works out better so I can maintain the skill power and not lose it through having to have a specific gun out. But that's just going to be up to you on what you want to use for that. Now, when it comes to the external components for the build, this is typically what I run for those. And then there are two other sets that I like to keep on hand, just depending on whether I'm doing group content or I'm doing void intercept battles, whether I'm doing solo or in a group. And those are going to be the Annihilation set and the Slayer set. So I would definitely pick up a set of those if you guys want to have those to flex in different places and different types of content. Most of the time, I'm just using the basic components you guys can see on the screen right here, though. So let's cover the guns I like to use on Valby. First is going to be Greg's Reversed Fate. The other one's going to be Enduring Legacy. I use these in void intercept battles, and I switch between the two, depending whether the boss is up or the boss is downed. Usually if the boss is downed, I try to switch to Greg's Reversed Fate and use it at that time because there's really nothing that out DPSs Greg's Reversed Fate when a boss is down just because of the bombardments. As for mobbing style stuff, I like to use Thunder Cage just because it gives me a little bit more AoE clear, but for the most part, I'm using my skills in most of the farming and group content like infiltrations. Now let's go ahead and move on to the actual builds themselves. First one is going to be this Gluttony carry build. The reason I call it the Gluttony carry build is because as opposed to building a maxed out Enzo, building a maxed out Gley, building a maxed out Haley, if you use this build, I can almost guarantee that you'll end up getting more clears of Gluttony than with any of those other builds just because it allows you to completely solo the mechanic. You've got tons of HP built into this, tons of recovery. We've got insanely low cooldowns, which lets us redirect the impurities very easily. If you're a solo player and you want to get some consistent clears in that, especially if you're in with a bunch of randoms, this is hands down probably the best build for doing that. So let's go ahead and get into the modules themselves. We're obviously using the Spiral Tidal Wave Transcendent module on her. This is just because this is what allows us to redirect the impurities. And what that does is it converts her one ability into this projectile. And it also changes it from a fusion skill to a dimension skill. And this is important because we're using multi-talented on this build. The reason being is because we're trying to get the cooldown of that skill to as low as possible, so we always have charges up in order to redirect the impurities, just because the boss moves around and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to get them there. So we're using MP conversion for the skill cooldown, Nimble Fingers for skill cooldown. We're also using Focus on non-attribute for the skill cooldown there, plus a little bit of damage. And then multi-talented, whenever we use a dimension skill, we're getting 20% increased skill cooldown for 5 seconds. So if we actually go look at this right here and we cast the skill, we can cast all three of these, and in one rotation of multi-talented, we get all 3 charges back. So that's the reason I like to do that. It's just because it gives me a lot more flexibility in moving those impurities around depending on where the boss is. And especially if people are just unloading on him, he can obviously get very close to his white mechanic very quickly. As for survivability, you're running increased HP and HP amplification, just so you have enough HP to survive a hit from him. The other thing is too, was we're using energy collection. This is actually boosting up our MP recovery out of combat and MP recovery in combat here, as well as it's adding to the MP recovery modifier so that we can keep up our MP throughout the fight without any issues. Then we have skill expansion. This just kind of gives us a little bit more range on our cleanup skill as well as the spiral tidal wave when we're killing some of the ads. MP conversion, MP accelerant. This is just here for the increased MP, but also it's here for the skill duration. The reason being is because whenever we hit the boss with spiral tidal wave, it applies the laundry defect to the boss, and this lowers his resistance to electric and non-attribute damage. Specifically, this is really good if you have bunnies or gleys in your group and they're using their massacre on the gley, for example. This can increase the amount of damage that they do. And then the last mod that we have is shot focus. This just adds a little bit of firearm attack damage to our gun, obviously. However, you could swap this out for anything else. It really just depends on if you have this mod or not, but it's not necessary for the build. If you can see here, we're at about 34,000 on Greg's for our firearm attack. If I actually take that mod off, you can see we only dropped to 32,000. So it's just adding to the base. It's not adding to the overall firearm attack. So it's not as big of a loss if you don't have it. One other thing I wanted to cover, just because with the new modding system, the mods I feel like can get kind of chaotic. So if you want to take a moment to screenshot what I have catalyzed here in the build, we have in a total, I think, 7 catalysts into Valby. So this is where I have them positioned. I don't have any double ups currently, so we don't have like a C and a Xantic and an Almudine in one slot. I just catalyzed one thing in each slot, and then we left the original 4, the 2 Rs, the M, and the Xantic here. In total, we obviously have the sub-attack module catalyzed as well too, but we've got 3 Ms, we've got 2 Cs, we've got 2 Rs, we've got 2 of the X's, and we have the 1 Almudine slot right here. Obviously, they can go anywhere you guys want, but that's where I have them. Next build I'm going to cover is going to be the Supply Moisture bossing build. This is what I use when I'm doing solo bossing. It's also what I use in the majority of content for any other intercepts if I don't want to use the Gluttony carry build or if I'm not doing Gluttony. If you guys want to take a moment to screenshot the build, feel free to do so before I start scrolling over all the modules. As for what we're running on the build, we're using increased HP amplification, just for more survivability. We're also using time distribution. This increases our HP, but also increases our skill cooldown, so we have our skills up a little bit more often. And then we're using auto immunity because this provides us negative 10% damage reduction to all attacks. So that's firearm, that's also to all elemental attacks. I really don't build a lot of defense on my builds. As you can see here, I got about 11,000, 24,000 HP. I really think building into HP is much more beneficial as opposed to building into defense, because defense has been shown to only really reduce the amount of damage that firearm attacks do. So that's like what guns that are actually shooting you from like ads and stuff like that. It doesn't really reduce the amount of damage that, say, Gluttony's ice attacks do. As for the rest of the mods on the build, we're using Nimble Fingers, skill expansion just to increase the range, skill extension for our water, because with Supply Moisture, if you didn't know, you're obviously wanting to stand on your water. Reason being is because it increases our firearm critical hit rate, and it also increases our skill critical hit rate when we're standing on our water. And the increased duration just means that it lasts a little bit longer. As for the other mods, we're using Focus on Non-Attribute. This just gives us a little bit more damage to kill the ads in the intercept battles. Valby's skills really don't do that much damage initially to bosses because everything's based on damage over time. It's very hard to get a boss to stand still long enough to really make use of her damage. So it just helps out with the ads that are running around. And then lastly, I'm running Shot Focus. This isn't necessarily necessary, as I've showcased earlier, but it does add a little bit more firearm attack damage. Now, if you guys want to do more damage on the build, there's a couple things you can switch out. We can actually take off auto immunity and energy collection, and we can run Walk-a-tightrope with conditional recharge here. And what this does, conditional recharge allows us to self-proc Walk-a-tightrope. Walk-a-tightrope gives us 30% increased skill power modifier, but also 30% increased firearm attack. And conditional recharge, what makes it so that whenever we use a skill, we consume some HP, and that allows us to bring our HP down below the 50%. The other thing you'd want to run if you're running that is you're going to want to switch to the Annihilation set, because this set's 4-piece gives us increased firearm attack when we have less than 50% HP. So as you can see, our firearm attack is currently sitting at 35,000. Sorry, 34,000. And it takes us approximately 5 skills to get down below the 50%. That's why I have it set at 10% as opposed to it maxed out on the module. And as you can see, we're sitting at about 10k HP right now, and our firearm attack went up from 34,000 to 41,000. The firearm attack will continue to increase as your HP gets lower. However, if you get too much lower, you're probably just going to end up on the floor. So this build, while it does provide a lot more damage, it is something that I typically only use in coordinated groups just because it can be a little bit of a nightmare in public lobbies, especially if the fights take a little bit longer, but it is how you would get the most damage out of Valby. Personally, if you don't want to use conditional recharge, or you're not comfortable using that, you can just use Walk-a-tightrope, and if you get hit by an attack, you'll probably be below 50% from Gluttony. And what you can run in place of that is, let me switch this module back here. You can run HP Collector to kind of pick yourself back up by killing an ad or something like that. The other thing would be, instead of HP Collector, you could run Energy Collection for a little bit more MP recovery throughout the fight. Those are just some of the options and kind of some of the choices that you can go with when it comes to the bossing build. So let's go ahead and move on to the solo stuff. So next up is going to be my Supply Moisture solo and group build. I use this most of the time if I'm soloing infiltrations or just doing any other content that's not gold farming. As for the mods we're running on this, of course, Supply Moisture. So if you guys want to take a moment to screenshot this, feel free to do so. We're running increased HP just for a little bit of survivability, Nimble Fingers MP conversion, as well as skill extension, skill expansion. This is all just to increase the range, duration, and cooldown of our cleanup skill, as well as our bubble bullet. So you can see we have a 3.2 second cooldown on bubble bullet, because these are honestly the two most used skills when you're doing infiltrations. And then we're running skill insight. This is just because we want our skills to hit a little bit harder sometimes with the crits. And this is obviously buffed up by Supply Moisture. So instead of the base 25% when we're standing on our water, we're sitting at 53% skill critical hit rate. Now, I don't really like to build too much into Valby's skills just because you would have to go through and redo a lot of these catalysts in order to get more skill critical hit rate into the build, and I don't really think it's necessary. We can already kill the majority of content with this setup right here. Because we're using Focus on Non-Attribute, we're using Technician instead of Focus on Dimension. The reason being is because Technician gives us flat skill power modifier that applies to all 4 of our skills, as opposed to just our cleanup and our plop plop, which are dimension skills. Because the other skill that I use the majority of the time in most content is the bubble bullet, and it's a fusion. So obviously if you put focus on dimension here, then it's not getting any benefit from that. And the majority of Valby's skills are all damage over time. The only one that has an initial damage burst is bubble bullet itself, which it has a really low skill power modifier of 469%. Just for reference, lepic's grenade does like 585, so it's less than a lepic grenade. Really, the majority of your damage comes from damage over time. And so what we're also coupling with that is Decimator, and this is because anytime we defeat an enemy, it gives us 5% increased skill power, and that stacks up to 10 times. So in total, between Decimator and Technician, we're sitting at 100% increased skill power modifier, which is what's buffing our damage over time. It's that waterway that's on the ground. Now, one change between solo and group that I do is in group content, I run Energy Collection. The reason being is because you're not always getting the kills. And so if you're not getting the kills all the time, then MP Collector kind of loses its benefit. So if you run this is going to buff up our MP recovery in combat, our MP recovery out of combat, and it's just going to make it a little bit easier to maintain full MP throughout the fight. If you're solo, then feel free to slot MP Collector here in the build. Moving on from there, we're going to have the gold farm setup. There's not a lot of change I made to this over the solo version, as you can see right here. Really, the only change is we switch this to focus on dimension just for the increased skill cooldown. And then because the majority of the time when you're doing gold farming, you're just using the cleanup skill. And that cleanup skill is dimension, so we're using that for our skill power modifier. And then battle of stamina, this is just giving us a little bit more duration. We're not running as much HP because we're just doing overland content that really isn't, most likely isn't going to kill us. And using battle of stamina increases our duration on our cleanup skill here up to 7.9 seconds. Obviously, if you have a reactor that has increased duration, that's just going to increase that as well too. Everything else is pretty much the same as the solo content one. Now, there's only one change that you would make here. This setup right here specifically is for farming outposts that have a boss with an immunity phase. If you're farming something like Vermilion Wastes or any of those outposts that have bosses that are just elites, you're actually going to want to take off skill expansion, and you're going to want to replace it with maximize duration. And that way you can keep your waterway very small, so you're less likely to kill the boss. And that's really the only change you would make between the low range and like the normal gold farming builds. Last build I'm going to cover is going to be the invasion setup. Now, this isn't necessarily as necessary anymore since they massively nerfed invasions, which I'm kind of bummed about, to be honest with you. But the only change here is we're just adding an HP collector because it adds a little bit more survivability into the build. Now, you could probably swap this out when they move to group invasions, and you can probably just switch this back to the solo / grouping build using energy collection if you want. But that's going to cover it for the builds that we have. So I wanted to cover where to get the supply moisture mod from if you guys do not currently have that. As a side note, if you need to find any mod, you can always come up here to the access info and just type in the mod that you're looking for. As you can see, we're looking for supply moisture. And if you click acquisition info, it's going to tell you where you can farm it from. We're specifically going to be farming this from the Fortress Frozen Valley Void Fusion Reactor. The reason being is because with the recent change to the game, you no longer need amorphous shards to open the fusion reactor, and it doesn't consume them unless you actually open an amorphous. So as you can see, I don't have enough shards to open this, but can still operate the reactor. They also massively nerfed these bosses, so they do way less damage. Or excuse me, they have way less health. And as you can see, he already died almost instantly. This is on hard, of course. So in just a couple shots, he's dead. And you just essentially farm him over and over again until the supply moisture mod drops. As an added bonus, you can also farm the acrobat set here, which is a decent set for Valby. However, it does lower her stats a little bit. And that is this set right here. It gives you, on the 4-piece set, a 21% increase to your firearm critical hit rate. On my Greg specifically, that gives me about a 10% buff when I'm standing on her water. Obviously, that'll change depending on what gun you have. And then as a side bonus, just this week specifically, you can actually farm the frozen singular reactors that are the best in slot reactors for Haley. So you're kind of killing 3 birds with one stone. You're getting supply moisture, the acrobat set, and you're also getting the Haley reactors. So that's where to farm supply moisture. So that's going to cover it for the builds. As always, if you guys want to see anything added to these, just feel free to leave a comment down below. I'm going to leave you guys with some gameplay as an outro. It's just going to cover an invasion run and then a couple bossing kills using my base Valby, but it applies to Ultimate Valby as well too. So, and then I'll have that base Valby build guide linked at the end of the video. If you guys want to check that out, if you're not quite leveled all the way up with Valby, or you don't have all the catalysts into her, you can take the concept from that video and apply it to Ultimate Valby. It's going to give you the same result, obviously. Big difference is just you're going to be able to utilize the spiral title mod in the Ultimate Valby setup that you can't utilize in the base Valby setup. So other than that, you guys have any questions? You need any help on your builds? I launched a Discord. You guys can join that. I'm always in there to help people if you guys need any help with anything, or have any questions on what to build, or need help clearing a boss, whatever it happens to be. I'm also streaming on Twitch and YouTube, so just tune in for that and check it out whenever you guys want. Other than that, thanks for watching. Have a good one.